Is NHS dental care affordable? Could Ukraine run out of money to fight Putin? And is the government's childcare plan in trouble? This is Politics Live. On the panel today, Conservative MP Tobias Ellwood, Labour MP Rebecca Long-Bailey, broadcaster and former Labour advisor Aisha Hazarika, and Conservative commentator Albie Amankona. Today, can the government solve the dental crisis?
We will be delivering up to 2.5 million more dental NHS appointments over the coming years.
The longer the Conservatives are in power, whether it's dentistry or GPs or operations, the longer patients will wait.
Will Donald Trump's supporters block military aid for Ukraine?
For those Republicans in Congress who think they can oppose funding for Ukraine and not be held accountable, history is watching.
And as the government promises to extend its free childcare offer, why are some nurseries struggling? We'll ask one provider why money's so tight. All that and Prime Minister's questions live at noon. Welcome. Let's start with this headline in BBC News because there is a battle over the nation's teeth. Dentists to get £20,000 incentive as part of plan to combat NHS shortfalls. Under the new plan, dentists will be offered a bonus to set up practices in areas of England with the poorest access to NHS care. A BBC investigation in 2022 found 9 in 10, 90% of NHS dental practices across the UK were not accepting new adult patients for treatment on the NHS. Perhaps that's why, as you can see here, hundreds of people were filmed queuing around the block outside a dental practice in Bristol to try and secure a place. Quite extraordinary, really. But my question to the politicians to start with, Tobias, is should you just come clean about the fact the idea of people, everyone, securing an NHS dentist is for the birds?
No, I don't agree with that. I think it's something that any government would like to make a commitment to say you should be able to access a dentist, and those queues there are totally unacceptable. But in your introduction, where you spelled out most of the cases, the big challenge has been from COVID because the original traditional construct, if you like, broke after that. People didn't return back to their dentistries. We don't have enough dentists as well. There's also something wrong between the private sector and indeed the state sector. We pay for dentists to be...
But it's that contract that hasn't worked, has it?
If I can finish.
Well,
that's what's tucked in the announcements today is also to fix that, perhaps to oblige dentists that are trained for by the state to then stay committed to working in the state sector before they move to the private sector.
How long have you had to do that?
Sorry?
How long have you had to do that since this wrangling over the contract?
Well, it's more to do with because of COVID, because of that disrupted completely. We couldn't access dentists because of infections and things like that. And clearly the old model, as I was saying, is no longer working, which is why you've got these huge incentives to encourage dentists to stay on, to expand their work.
Sure.
But the critical question I make, and I stress, is why are we paying for dentists to be trained by the state to then go straight to the private sector? That needs to change.
Right. Well, you've had a long time to change it. And they complain, of course, that the contracts are unfair and they don't make enough money to do that NHS work. But the same problem will exist for a Labour government if it comes in. Should you just be more honest? You've got plans to have kids' teeth brushed in school and so on and so forth. But in the end, the idea, when you just look at that one example of people getting an NHS dentist, it's just a myth.
It's not a myth. It's been chronically underfunded for nearly 15 years.
Oh, so you're going to put a lot more money into it?
Exactly, and provide incentives to train new dentists, put out an urgent programme to provide immediate appointments, and then there's a longer-term plan to reform the dental contract because, as you say, it just isn't financially viable for many dentists to provide NHS services. But the fact is, at the moment, we've got huge parts of the country that are dental deserts. It's so bad and so unaffordable for people to access private dentistry that people are resorting to pulling out their teeth with pliers. That's how acute this crisis is and how urgent it is to solve it.
How's it come to this? I mean, is it going to be a big political issue at the election now? Teeth?
Well, I think what it does do, it provides another really powerful optic about this narrative of broken Britain. That's what it does. It's like it's another thing which adds to a list of things in terms of not being able to get an appointment to see your GP. You know, there are problems all across the country. We can't get our infrastructure done. And now on a really, really basic level, I mean, the sight of those people queuing up at that dentist and zoning into like older people who brought little chairs with them to sit, like because the queues were so long, people having their dentures in that, you just thought, this is like something out of Victorian Britain. What is going wrong? And the other thing is, a lot of people will see this and think, oh, this is just a health issue. It's not. We've got both parties talking about the economy. You cannot have a growing economy without a healthy workforce. So health and wealth are intrinsically linked. If we don't sort out our public services, if we don't sort out health service, if we don't sort out people's health, we're talking about teeth. There's another story which is not growing lists of mental health, particularly for young people. If we don't get this fixed, we are not going to grow our economy.
Those images are extremely compelling, aren't they? Whichever side of the argument you are on, just watching those queues for something that most people would assume is basic and fundamental, having your teeth checked.
It's shameful. I mean, it's unbelievable that in modern-day Britain we're seeing queues outside of dentists. I know at my local dentist, whenever I go and sit in the waiting room, the phone is ringing with people looking to be registered with an NHS dentist, and they say they are not accepting new NHS patients at all. And that's just not good enough. But I do just want to come back on this point about dental deserts, because that seems to be where the focus is on today. But if 9 in 10 dental practices aren't taking on new NHS dentists, is it really just dental deserts that need to be tackled here? That indicates to me there's a problem in 90% of the country.
All right, we're going...
Just to add to that.
Briefly.
Absolutely right to say that there are places across Britain that are worse affected. This is why we're having mobile dental units come in. Not a long-term solution, I agree, absolutely, but it will help in the short term to affect those areas that are particularly badly hit.
All right, let's have a look at this headline in The Guardian. You were talking about the health and wealth of the nation. Aisha Starmer unwavering over Labour Green Pledge, despite claims party dropping it. Labour leader says £28 billion, how many times have we heard that figure, green investment desperately needed after sources said last week Labour were planning to ditch the policy. Yes, this is what's become something of a saga. Exactly what is happening with Labour's £28 billion green prosperity plan? It is the pledge to spend borrowed money on green projects and, in the party's words, turn the UK into a growth superpower. Well, Keir Starmer, the Labour leader, was clear in using that figure in an interview with Times Radio yesterday and saying it's very, very important, in contrast to other members of his top team who've been reluctant to use it. Let's have a listen.
We're going to need investment. That's where the £28 billion comes in, that investment that's desperately needed for that mission.
Doesn't that make the £28 billion you thought was a pledge and now a vague ambition, make that totally unaffordable? And isn't it time you were honest about it?
Well, I've always been really clear, Simon, that all of our policies are subject to our fiscal rules.
Is it a pledge or is it not a pledge? Can you use the word pledge?
The pledge is for public investment. The overall amount of spending is determined by our fiscal rules.
Rebecca, as a Labour MP, what is the policy?
For the 28 billion, well, it's to provide 28 billion during the course of the Parliament to invest that in green industry and green infrastructure. And if you're serious about growth, you have to be serious about investment in infrastructure, because that catalyses private investment. It provides long-term certainty for business.
So why Rachel Reeves and Johnny Reynolds, shadow business and shadow chancellor, why couldn't they make it a pledge, repeat the pledge and say £28 billion?
They've got to be very careful in what they say. And when they're spending that 28 billion during the course of a Parliament, they will have to very carefully provide evidence to Parliament and the Labour Party that those investment decisions are strategic and that they will provide an economic return for the country, either through future jobs, regional investment or future tax returns to the Exchequer.
But it's made everyone think it's not happening. You can see why, just looking at those two examples.
Keir's been very clear that it is happening and it's important that it does.
Right. I mean, it was announced in 2021, Aisha, just to give us a little bit of history, as an additional £28 billion funded by borrowing. Then it became minus the money the government is already spending on green projects, around £10 billion, so therefore only around £18 billion of new money. Then, as we've just heard from Rebecca, ramping that up, to use the expression by Labour, to £28 billion by about 2027. Now, we're not sure if the £28 billion figure is in doubt, although it's been restated by Keir Starmer. Is this confusion helpful to Labour's election strategy?
I don't think Labour is going to win or lose the election on this figure of £28 billion.
But the confusion
I don't think Labour's going to lose the election because of a confusion on this, to be absolutely honest. And look, we're still a long way off with the election. We've just been talking about the state of broken Britain. But what I think what Labour strategists will admit is that they maybe regret pinning a number on it so early when there was so many things moving. And of course, since then, lots of things have changed, including, Liz Truss and the mini budget. But I think what the Labour Party has got to do is just stay strong on this commitment. Interestingly, when I speak to business, and I do quite a lot of work with businesses, a lot in terms of green manufacturing, which is very much a growth business, and people see that as a business of the future. They are not at all bothered about this kind of row about the number, because they feel that this is a really good policy and they know that more money is going to come in because it's happening in America. Biden has done a huge thing with his Inflation Reduction Act. The EU is mimicking this at all. So if you want to say you're going to have a growing economy and you want to invest in jobs in the future, you are going to have to invest a lot of money. Maybe it might be 26 billion in the end. The other thing as well, which a lot of people, in terms of actually delivering this money, you have to work with business to pay the money. So I think what Labour's got to do is not be scared of the Tory attack line. The Tory attack lines are saying this is going to be £28 billion of terrible funding. I think Labour shouldn't be scared of that, because you just say Liz Truss.
I mean,
but isn't that the point?
If they just stuck to their guns from the beginning and didn't look like they were wavering around, is it going to be 28 billion? Is it going to be 26 billion? Is it going to be 18 billion? Then fine, fair enough. Make your point, make your argument, and say this is what we're doing because we believe in growth. But they are scared of what the Tories are saying. And what it looks like, at least from the right wing of politics, is that the attack lines that the Tories are using against them are working.
Rebecca?
I don't think the polls bear that out, or the by-elections.
On this particular
policy,
but
I think to be fair, the polls and the by-elections do not bear that out.
So why are they wavering over it then?
Because they're trying to make sure that where Labour has had a historical weakness, time immemorial, it's on the economy. Largely, because of, from the Jeremy Corbyn years, there was lots of attacks on Labour's handling of the economy. So you can see why Labour are being nervous. There's that great phrase, isn't there, which Roy Hattersley said, that Labour in opposition is like carrying a Ming vase over a highly polished floor. And I think that's the challenge they're doing. But I do have some sympathy with what you're saying. I think they should be stronger about this. It's a good policy. It's popular with business. It's popular on the doorstep.
But
it's popular
with the damage being done over confusion. What do you say to Aisha's point that it's post-Jeremy Corbyn years, the pledges to spend and borrow so much more, that the Ming vase strategy over this has come into play?
I take Aisha's comment about being nervous. I understand that the front bench are nervous about this, but this is a decision that is going to increase growth dramatically over the course of a parliament. We should be confident in our arguments. And I think what's happened, unfortunately, over the last few months is that there's been a lot of dialogue in the media, and it's created an impression that there isn't confidence, when there actually is. When I speak to front bench colleagues about this, they've got very robust plans on the matter, and that's the message that we should be putting to our electorate. And even in the time when I was in the shadow cabinet, we had very robust plans, and we tried our best, and sometimes maybe failed on the messaging somewhat. I'll agree, and I'll take that on board. But we proved very clearly that the amount of money that we're investing was going to dramatically increase growth, was going to dramatically increase jobs and investment.
And you're convinced, but it's not even in the Let's Get Britain's Future Back, this Labour pamphlet, not the specific figure here. It's got Keir Starmer there on the front, but it's not in there. Why not?
There's a lot of detail that isn't in there, and the position in relation to each policy will be set out in far more detail prior to a general election.
What I would say
as we've seen with the dentist position, we outlined our policy on dentistry in quite a lot of detail, and the Tories stole it. So we have to be very careful in terms of what we set out in detail.
I mean, it's a good point. Well, I'll come back.
OK, I don't think we're going to be borrowing this idea of borrowing 28 billion.
Why not?
Because we tried that under Liz Truss and it didn't work. OK, so this is the strategy and how you deal with our economy. I disagree, if I may. What's going to be important in the next election is who's going to manage this country through this continued difficult times with international headwinds affecting our economy.
Well,
what we're seeing here...
Are you saying that the Conservatives have?
Let me make my point, then please come back. But to borrow 28 billion, which we have not got, which we have not. Whatever you're going to do with it, borrowing 28 billion that you have not got will see interest rates increase. If interest rates go up, so does inflation. We've just come through a period whereby we're seeing deficit come down, we're seeing debt come down as well, interest rates starting to settle as well. Why would you then want to jeopardise that by borrowing 28 billion?
And is this what's making these are the Tory attack lines that you call them?
Just because the other side of good. The reason why
hang on, but this is mainly about Labour, and I will come back to you. But Rebecca, you want to respond?
The reason why the comparison with Liz Truss is look how the market's punished, and look how fiscal responsibility is so important. Something the Conservatives pride ourselves on, which is why we moved on from that. And now Labour are very nervous about.
Tobias has made a really excellent point, and this is so important. I'm really glad you've raised this. Liz Truss totally spooked the markets because her unfunded tax cuts came out of nowhere, and we literally watched the pound crash as she. And then not only that, Kwasi Kwarteng went on Laura Kuenssberg and said there could be more cuts to come. The difference between that, and you're absolutely right to think about fiscal discipline, is that nobody could say that this policy is going to be sprung on anybody. This policy has been talked. Hang on, let me finish. Let me finish. This is something which has got huge buy-in from business, because they know that this is the kind of investment that we see happening in America, and the markets in America haven't been spooked by this. In fact, America's economy is growing really, really well. Jobs are growing well. Inflation is not as well as America.
Faster than Germany's now.
That's because Germany. But your argument about spooking the markets doesn't bear witness on this, Tobias.
What about to have tax cuts or not to have tax cuts? Isn't that the same row that is going on in the Conservative Party for the reasons you've just set out? Because you do not want to do anything that spooks the markets or looks unaffordable. Where are you on the tax cuts?
Absolutely right. Well, you heard Jeremy Hunt in the November statement. What did he do? He came out with £20 billion of tax incentives to get our industry and our business working, for them to invest in their capitalisation and move their countries.
And just recently he said there may not be as much scope for tax cuts.
Maybe not be. And that's, again, fiscal responsibility returning to the Conservative ranks.
Right. Let's just have a look at this headline just before we move on. Cracks between Starmer and Reeves are starting to show over this particular issue, because Rachel Reeves says no policy is outside our fiscal rules, and no policy, including the Green Prosperity Plan, sits outside of those rules. That, in the end, is going to be more important than the investment in green policies.
Well, I think that's rubbish that there are cracks between Starmer and Reeves at the moment on this issue. And I think Rachel's right in terms of constantly outlining our fiscal rule that you only spend on your day-to-day spending what you receive in tax, and that you make sure that when you do invest and you borrow to invest, that you have your debt falling as a proportion of GDP over the course of a pilot. That is crucial.
Right.
It's important.
And it's more crucial.
That is achievable with the 28 billion, and Rachel's already done the calculations on that.
How will you do anything different with public services funding than the Conservatives if that is the line that you are taking? People have big expectations of what a Labour government might bring. They expect a lot more on public spending than what they're getting now. But you've basically just said you're not going to spend any more than the Tories on anything. So why are people voting for the Labour Party?
No, we're not saying we're not going to spend any more. That's our fiscal rule, but we will look at efficiencies in the system. I think Rachel has been very clear on that. And I think there's also, in my own personal view, I think there's a discussion to be had about the black hole that's in our public finances. Our local authorities and our public services are going to need an immediate injection of cash to deal with 15 years of chronic underfunding and austerity. And I hope that there are conversations that the party's having now. For example, looking at a wealth tax is one option that Rachel could consider.
Yeah, but she's not.
She's not at the moment, and hopefully...
Oh, you think she might?
Well, possibly. It's my hope, but she might not, but who knows? But there's certainly a growing consensus around this, and groups such as Patriotic Millionaires UK have been repeatedly campaigning on this issue.
Right, well, we'll leave it there, because we're going to talk about the Russia-Ukraine war, because tonight a US border and a Ukraine aid bill is being debated. It's a piece of legislation that pledges a further $60 billion in American military aid to Ukraine, amongst other things. Donald Trump has urged Republicans not to vote for it. Let's have a look at the reaction here in the Financial Times. Joe Biden, the US president, blames Donald Trump for sinking US deal to fund Ukraine war effort. Let's welcome Fred Fleitz from Washington, D.C. He served as Chief of Staff on Donald Trump's National Security Council. Hello to you. Why don't Trump supporters like this bill?
Pleasure to be here. Well, there is a growing concern in the United States that there has to be a plan to end this war, a route to a ceasefire, route to peace talks. There's a growing belief that this is a war of attrition Ukraine will lose. And there's no mention in this bill of peace talks or ceasefire. Instead, there's a call for a report on how we can provide weaponry to Ukraine so we can win the war. I would like Ukraine to win the war, but I think we're past that moment. And until there's a realistic approach to this conflict, I don't think it's going to get Republican support.
Right. I mean, Joe Biden, as you know, has had some pretty strong warnings and criticism for Republicans considering blocking the bill. He says Republicans owe it to the American people to show some spine and do what they know to be right. History is watching. A failure to support Ukraine at this critical moment will never be forgotten. Does that weigh heavily on your shoulders?
I think the argument that the appearance of Russia winning will be a threat to democracy, could embolden America's adversaries is a valid point. But frankly, we are past that moment. That's something Joe Biden should have thought of a long time ago when Ukraine needed the weapons which it could have used to win. We're now in a long-time ceasefire that is killing a generation of Ukrainian men. Trump says, let's end the fighting. And this isn't just the view of Republicans. Richard Haas, the president of the Council of Foreign Relations, no friend of Trump, he believes this. Henry Kissinger believes this. Let's stop the fighting. Let's freeze this conflict. Let's arm Ukraine to the teeth. Let's work on getting Ukraine its territory back through negotiations rather than destroying the country further.
All right, Fred, let's bring in our other guest, Tobias Elwood. How can you convince Fred Fleitz to have a different viewpoint to help this bill go through? He says the moment's passed.
I'm really concerned. I don't know if you speak for Donald Trump, but is that his position, that he would want a ceasefire, that he'd want to introduce talks, that he would allow Russia to redraw the map in Eastern Europe? Because if that happens, Russia will not stop there. You talk about giving Ukraine the weapon systems they need. Why isn't Donald Trump then pledging to say we will give Ukraine the ATACMS and the other missiles that they require? That's what we need to see. Otherwise, as I say, this is going to be one part of the world that changes in a very fragmented, contested world where we're seeing other problems around. The threshold for the West to handle all these plates spinning is really being tested now. We need to sort this out in Ukraine. And it really worries me that Donald Trump will come in here and want to close the issue off, even remove support, military funding and support for Europe as a whole.
Fred?
I think Trump will use his leadership to force Putin and Zelensky to come to the negotiating table. And this idea that Russia's going to invade other countries after Ukraine is frankly a myth. Russia has been the loser in this war.
You're willing
Ukraine's
to take that risk,
too. There's no doubt of that.
You're willing to take that risk.
Russia's military has been destroyed. Its reputation has been destroyed. And as I said, the moment when we could have given Ukraine the weapons to win, that moment has passed.
You still can give Ukraine the weapons to win.
The Council of Foreign Relations disagrees with you. So did Henry Kissinger. So did a growing number of people on the left in the United States who don't see the point of an endless war of attrition. It's time to end this war. Let's start negotiations. The reality is we may have to wait Putin out until we can get this territory back to Ukraine.
All right.
But let's not advocate this nonsense that Russia's going to invade NATO after Ukraine. There's no evidence of it.
All right, Albie.
With respect to Fred, I don't think he is being entirely honest. This bill is also linked, of course, to the southern border crisis in the US, and there's been a bipartisan effort to try and get some more money to solve the problem at the southern border. Is this not really, Fred, about the fact that Donald Trump wants him to be elected later on this year with as much mess as possible coming from the Democrats so he can say, I'm the one that's going to clean it up? If this bill is seen as being successful at solving the issues on the southern border, if this bill is seen as being successful at solving the problems that we're seeing in Ukraine, there's less of a mess for Trump to clean up.
Fred?
I think it really was incumbent upon President Biden to have three separate votes on Israel, on Ukraine, and on the southern border. But instead, he held Ukraine hostage to the southern border and made a deal on the southern border that most Republicans oppose. And I know there's allegations right now that this bill's going down because Trump and his supporters don't want to give Biden win.
All right.
And look, maybe that's a valid argument, but
And
I don't think that's the case.
And it is true that there were lots of things, and there are lots of things bound up in this bill, but I want to focus on what could happen as a result in terms of support for Ukraine. Last week, Tobias, the EU managed to get its Ukraine funding package approved, but it was a struggle. We're seeing Biden clearly facing those same struggles. Is there a trend here in terms of support in this financial way for Ukraine?
That is the worry that we're seeing, an accumulation of an absence of commitment that we're seeing. It's starting to wane as it drags on because we're not giving Ukraine the facilities and the military equipment that they need to conclude this. And it really worries me. It's really scary to hear somebody close to Donald Trump who possibly could get elected, saying, I'm happy to talk about a ceasefire, talks. That is appeasement. That's 1937 all over again.
All right, we'll come back to Fred in just a moment. Rebecca, your thoughts on this? Because we have heard in the last couple of years since this war started, it's fuelling inflation, making things like energy much more expensive here. Do you agree that Fred might have a point with some Republicans that it's not sustainable?
Well, the concerns I've got with the US vote is that it provides quite a lot of wider geopolitical instability. And the reason for this is that America, the US and the UK signed up in 1994 to a memorandum with Ukraine, and that was in return for Ukraine relinquishing its nuclear weapons arsenal on its exit from the Soviet Union. Now, interestingly, Russia was a party to that memorandum as well and haven't observed their obligations. But the question will be for the US to decide, are you a country that keeps your promises internationally, or are you not a country that keeps your promises internationally? And that's where the instability lies.
Right. I mean, it is about reputation and standing in the world, Fred. The idea, as some of the guests have suggested, if there's less enthusiasm for America's commitment to NATO too and Article 5, that is going to lead to more instability.
Well, Ukraine is not a member of NATO, so Article 5 doesn't apply here.
No,
and
but if it were to invade another country that is a member of NATO?
Putin is not going to risk a nuclear war by invading a NATO member, and I think people who assert that are making things up. But I think the points by your last guest are valid. We did make commitments to Ukraine. We didn't abide by them. As I said, that moment has passed. We can wish we hadn't done that, but we're in a situation now where Russia is deeply dug in. It is bringing out more reserves. Ukraine is running out of soldiers. And the responsible thing, the thing that I think is most responsible for the country is to end the war, get Ukrainian refugees to come back to the country, rebuild the country, arm the country to the teeth, and begin a long-term process to get Ukrainian territory back by peace. The fellow who spoke to you a moment ago, brilliant guy. If he believes that, why don't we send in British and American troops? That's how we could kick Russia out. No one wants to do that.
Ukraine is not asking for troops. They have plenty. Ukraine has plenty of boots on the ground themselves, their own people. They've got the courage to step forward. What they're missing is the military equipment that we should be providing them.
Right. I mean, it is interesting, though, when you say, yes, they're not asking for troops on the ground, but the outgoing chief of the General Staff, Aisha, General Sir Patrick Sanders, has warned that the UK needs to grow its military by around 45,000 in the next 3 years and equip a citizen army. I mean, is this the sort of thing that we need to be looking at?
Well, let's not kid ourselves. We are in no fit state right now. Even if we did want to put boots on the ground, that's not going to happen. But I think what's really interesting about your guest's argument, and I do agree with Tobias on this, it's just fascinating to hear somebody representing Donald Trump, who has had lots of criticism for having too close a relationship with President Putin, essentially saying, let's just appease Putin, let's just go slow, let's go in his timeline. I'm sure he will do the right thing and give Ukraine its land back. That is for the birds. Also, interestingly, if these guys are now putting forward an argument for an immediate ceasefire and getting round the table and talking, I presume they're going to say the same thing about the situation in Israel and Gaza right now.
I think it's interesting because we're getting this view from across the pond, which is saying, well, what's the end point of this conflict? Wow. And it doesn't really seem to be a discussion that we're having at all on this panel, or that we really have enough in Europe. It's just we must give Ukraine as much military aid as possible so they can beat Putin without actually thinking, well, what is the end game here? Which is why I think it's interesting to hear from Fred over in the US to actually talk about what an end game might look like. Yes, we might not like it, but shouldn't we be thinking about what the end game looks like and how we get there, rather than just condemning Ukraine and Russia to this endless war?
But I think the difficulty is to get any sort of talks, you're going to have to get Zelensky. In terms of all the people I speak to from Ukraine, I speak to Ukrainians regularly on my show. They have not done anything wrong. They have just gone about their lives, and Russia has invaded them to try and take their land and to take over their kind of society as well. So I think that would be fine if you could say, look, both sides had done some wrong. Come on, guys, let's meet in the middle. Let's hammer out a deal. For the Ukrainians, they understandably do not think they have done it, because they haven't. This is pure Russian aggression on Ukraine. That makes peace talks very, very, very difficult.
Exactly. We've entered a new era of insecurity. This
but what is the
one
end game?
Element of it. And that's why General Saunders spoke as he did. We need to brace ourselves and prepare ourselves for a new decade of instability. Our world is fragmented, becoming ever more contested. Indeed, it's splintering into two spheres of competing influence.
But Tobias,
you've got China, if I can finish, China, Russia, and indeed Iran, the global south sitting out, and then the West. And the West is too risk-averse to stand up to this latest round of aggression. This new period of instability is only going to grow. And if we allow Russia to move forward into Eastern Europe, it won't stop there. There's an awful lot of Europe that's not in NATO. That's where Russia will go to next.
But what does the West look like and European security with less US support? Because I guess this is the nub of the question, isn't it? If Donald Trump gets in, is he going to pull out of NATO? If Donald Trump gets in, is he going to put less military aid into Ukraine? What does that look like, European security, with less US support?
And that is
right, well, let me just...
the FCO and indeed other parts.
All right, well, let's get a final thought. Is that what could happen, Fred, if, first of all, Donald Trump wins the Republican nomination, which looks highly likely, and were to win the presidential election? Pulling out of NATO, no longer Europe can rely on the US for support.
You know, I read The Economist, the London Guardian. I see all this extreme worry about Trump coming to office. I'll remind you that during 4 successive presidencies, Putin invaded neighboring states during 3 of them, but not the Trump administration, because Trump was a decisive leader who Putin thought was unpredictable. This isn't going to be appeasement. This is bringing back a credible and strong president to promote global security. That's what we need right now. That's why I think Trump has a chance of ending this war. It's going to be distasteful. I don't like seeing Russia holding on to any Ukrainian territory. But as I said, the moment has passed where we can roll this back by throwing more weapons in. We have to stop the killing.
But
we have
Trump
to rebuild
did promise,
Ukraine.
did threaten to pull out of NATO. That's not going to help European security.
We're going to finish it there.
That's not going to happen.
Oh, well, we heard it here first. Fred Fleitz, thank you very much for joining us. We're going to talk about something completely different, which is childcare and childcare policies. We've talked a lot about this already this week on the programme, and that's because you will remember that in the spring budget last year, parents of 2-year-olds were promised 15 hours free childcare a week from April, and then in September this year, eligible children from 9 months will get 15 hours of childcare per week during term time. But we now hear that this key policy pledge may not be met on time. Let's listen to the Education Secretary, Gillian Keegan.
What you can't do, Trevor, which I think you probably know, is guaranteeing something in the future that you're not in control of all the bits.
Right. You're not in control of all the bits, as she put it so succinctly, and that sounds like she can't guarantee that the pledge will actually come into operation in April. Let's talk to Jerry Garvey, the owner of Muddy Boots Nursery in Penrith, Cumbria. Welcome to you. Can you deliver on the government's policy as it stands?
Firstly, good morning. No, in response to your question, the answer is no. I think the government are relying on, obviously, all the nursery providers to actually be on side and provide that service. Many of them, like myself at the moment, are not able to. One, because we're full already and there's no space. Secondly, those nurseries who may be able to provide have not got enough staff to reach their potential. And thirdly, the money they're offering does not meet the need of the nurseries.
Right. Well, Tobias, it sounds like there's a massive problem on the government's hand with this rather cornerstone key policy pledge.
And there's an awful lot of us, backbenchers, that are lobbying the Chancellor at this very moment to see whether we can actually fix this. And hopefully we will get an announcement in the March statement. it's so important that we honour this pledge, that we allow childcare to continue to grow and advance. So we're from 9 months to the age of school starting age, that parents are able to put their children in some form of a nursery.
Right.
That is our commitment. It was supposed to start in 2025. I think this full package of measures has been graduated. I will be lobbying very hard to make sure that we are still committed. What Gillian Keegan was talking about there was the numbers of stakeholders that are involved. And you just heard some comments there of some of the challenges that we face, the actual locations themselves, the number of nursing support and so forth. That all needs to be addressed. But ultimately, it comes down to money. And that's why the Chancellor, I hope, will make some positive announcements on this in March.
Right. I mean, Jerry, you're reassured by that. I mean, Tobias Ellwood seems to be crossing his fingers for a policy that he very much believes in, to hear what the Chancellor has to say next month.
Well, it sounds OK on paper, but firstly, what he's got to remember is, for the policy to work, you've got to have the staff. There's been a chronic underfunding in the childcare sector for many years now, and as a result, a lot of those who have worked in the sector have actually left and not gone on to other employment because it pays more. You know, unfortunately, the policies that are put in place, every year the funding's available, but what doesn't happen is it goes up the interest rates, meets the current interest rates when we have increases in national living wages, taxes and everything else. So there's a big divide between the two, and nursery just cannot afford to operate under that.
Right. I mean, Rebecca, you also, or the Labour Party, very much wants to have a transformative childcare policy. But again, I mean, look at what's happened here. Do you take note that it's not that easy if you haven't got the staff and the places?
Well, you actually have to have a detailed plan, and I think this is where the government's problems lie, where they made a promise and broke that promise because they hadn't filled out the detail. There was a skills crisis when the Chancellor made that announcement. Childcare organisations warned him at the time that the promise was unsustainable without huge investment in the skills in that particular sector. Nurseries themselves, as Jerry has just said, can't afford to provide the extra childcare because their margins are so low. They're struggling as it is, and nurseries are closing up and down the country because they're not finding it financially sustainable.
So what could Labour do in the envelope that exists at the moment?
Well, what Bridget's agreed to do is to have a childcare review, to look at it with the sector comprehensively. And she's also been exploring plans to look at the role of primary schools and nurseries within primary schools to see if they can be used as a vehicle to roll out rapid childcare.
Right. I mean, there's obviously a gap here, Jerry, between ambition and desire on the politician side and what can practically be delivered. Are you turning parents away at the moment?
Yes, we are. I've actually got no places up until September 2025 in certain rooms. That's because the demand is so high and the availability of places is so low.
Albie?
Huge problem. I think it's absolutely right, and I'm so pleased Jerry brought up the fact that it's also a people problem, a workforce problem. I was having a conversation earlier on with someone from the Fawcett Society who said exactly the same thing. There just aren't enough people going into these childcare roles. So it's all well and good to say the government's going to spend £7 billion on nursery places by 2025. But if people aren't going into nursery teaching, no one is going to be able to send their children to nursery. And I think there's also something else that we can do. Not everything Liz Truss did was bad when she was in government. She did also start the conversation about childcare ratios in the United Kingdom compared to in European countries where childcare ratios are lower. So there is a regulatory reform aspect to this as well, which could deliver cheaper childcare.
I'll just get a note from... What did you make of the extending of ratios, Jerry, when Liz Truss suggested it? Would that be something you'd support?
Absolutely not. Right. For the reason, for those of us that work with children, especially this is inherent to the 2-year-olds. You know, the ratio originally was 1 to 4, and it's been increased to 1 to 5. You know, you've got 4 or 5 2-year-old children who need a lot of care and attention. Some are not speaking yet, haven't got language. Some are still in nappies and that. For one practitioner, that's a lot to take on. If you have a busy nursery class, it can be quite stressful some days. The end result is, if we do 1 to 5 over long term, we burn our staff out and we have more emotional wellbeing problems, and that adds to our recruiting woes.
Well, I'm actually on the board of the Fawcett Society, so this is something that we have been looking into a great deal. It's really important for children's development to have good, high-quality childcare. It's also so important for not just mums but dads, families as well, in terms of trying to get people back to work. And I think if you care about families and if you care about trying to support people back into work, you have got to properly support this service. It's sort of, again, there's a theme through this programme, whether it's dentistry, whether it's NHS waiting lists, whether it's mental health services, whether it's our care sector. You've got a crisis in all these services.
And does it all need money? Is it money that will transfer?
I'm afraid it does need money. It needs a number of things. Money is very, very important. You cannot do childcare on the cheap. It is not fair to expect nursery providers and nursery staff in the same way it's not fair to expect carers who are paid barely minimum wage to pick up the slack for the fact that this stuff is not properly invested. What you also need, to Albie's point, and this applies to carers and other things as well, if you are making, and it is often women working in these low-paid sectors where they are paid peanuts, they are expected to pick up the emotional slack of families where it's caring for older people, caring for our babies and our toddlers. If we care about this connective tissue of society, we as a society and as a state, and come together, wherever your politics are, and say, we've got to fund this properly.
No disagreement here from the politicians. It sounds like you're committed to that. Jerry, if there was one thing that the politicians could do to help you deliver the policy as it stands, what would it be?
I think more engagement with the actual sector itself. I've heard a couple of times in here, let's engage with this and that. I go to lots of meetings and speak to lots of nursery providers, be up in Cumbria. I go nationally with the likes of National Day Nurseries Association. And the sense of the matter I get sometimes is there's just not enough engagement, or lip service is paid to what they're saying. These people are the professionals. They need to be listened to. You know, they're not there to con anybody out of their money. They want it to work. At the end of the day, it's people's children, and we should remember that.
Thank you very much, Jerry. You wanted to say something.
Just reflecting on that, one of the things that the late, great Dame Tessa Giles did was when she was in opposition with a lot of other really good Labour women MPs, including Harriet Harman and others, they knew childcare was a huge issue, and they really, and that was a big thing of more women coming into Parliament as well in 1997. And the Sure Start Centres, which was very much a project pioneered by the brilliant Tessa Giles, had a really big impact. And I think it would be really good for political parties not to use things like this as a political football, because that was actually quite a good structure. Children's care is too important for it just to be weaponised and politicised.
Well, it may be discussed at Prime Minister's questions. Let's go into the chamber because MPs are filing in for questions beforehand. We've got a few minutes to go. And, of course, Rishi Sunak may be mulling over the launch of another group or family within the Conservative fraternity and sorority. It was called Popular Conservatism, led by his predecessor, Liz Truss. What do you make of the group?
Populism is dangerous. It builds on fears. It uses sound bites to try and win across support, and it's very short-termism. We've just spoken about the rise of authoritarianism across the world. We're seeing an erosion in democracies as well. And I don't want to see it in Britain, and I certainly don't want to see it in the Conservative Party. We're months away from a general election. So to learn that yet another group is being formed that's not rallying and supporting the Prime Minister, frankly, I really don't understand it. It stems, I'm afraid, from our system, the fact that we choose a leader and it's our membership that makes that decisions. And all this, the noise that's being made, whether it be whatever group it is all about appeasing our base, not looking beyond our base. Our successful prime ministers are the ones that take our base forward, but appeal to the country as a whole. Right. That's what we should be doing, and that's what Rishi Sunak is doing.
Right. I mean, I would be careful by insulting the Tory base. It's the Tory base that goes out every weekend campaigning out of the goodness of their hearts for free for MPs like you to stay in Parliament. So just be careful about what you say about the base. The base, actually, at the last leadership election, wanted Kemi Badenoch and Penny Mordaunt in the final two. The MPs gave us Rishi Sunak and Liz Truss. So you'll have a part in what's happened with the Conservative Party since 2022. What I would say about populism, though, is that I totally agree with you. I think Liz Truss's popcorn is a complete farce. But we've got to think about why populism happens. It's because ruling parties don't do what they say on the tin. The Conservatives haven't cut migration, we haven't cut taxes, we haven't been good enough on defence, and that is when populism thrives.
Right. I mean, expectation management is very important, isn't it, for political parties? Is that why Keir Starmer is as careful and as cautious in so many of the areas in politics as he is at the moment, according to some on your wing of the party?
think so, but then the real test will come when we're in government, when those expectations from our constituents will be rightly high, because they will expect a Labour government to make their lives better. And that's what we need to do in the first 100 days of government, in outlining bold, radical policies. We've already got some. The New Deal for working people's fantastic. Some of the green policies that we've outlined, fantastic. But we're going to have to go a lot further to win and retain that trust of our voter base, to show that the Labour Party really does change lives.
Aisha?
Well, I think what the Conservative Party is about to go through is what happened in the Labour Party, where a populist base sort of dominates the party. And I think you are about to enter your sort of blue momentum phase, and that will mean a lot of infighting. I mean, there's already been a lot of
infight. Not if some of us can help it.
And it will be a gift to the Labour
But why
Party.
has Rishi Sunak not been able to convince Jacob Rees-Mogg, Liz Truss and all those other people that were at that popcorn, as they call it?
If I'm honest, I think they've potentially written off our prospects at the next election, and that makes it harder.
Have
but
you?
I stress, and I just underline, the importance of our base. But our membership also recognise that MPs, the parliamentarians, need to make that final decision.
All right.
Include the membership, but allow the MPs the final
Let's listen
choice.
to Rishi Sunak.